Good morning. I'm honored to have as a guest speaker our ambassador in residence, John Craig, John B. Craig. He was appointed by President Clinton as the ambassador to Oman, and then was working for President George Bush as a special assistant to the president for combating terrorism on September 2001. His responsibilities include preventing September 11th from happening again. He has a career of foreign service for a lifetime.
Good morning. At least we're dry. Yeah. What I'm going to do this morning is try and put you in the picture about how national security policy is made. I'm not trying to convince you that I know a lot about national security policy. What I'm trying to show you is how the process works, and hopefully then you can make some decisions about how you might get involved in that process, how you might try to influence that process, because it's a very difficult process to influence, but it affects all of our lives. All of the decisions that an administration take in terms of national security policy affects everyone from declaration of war to international trade agreements. And our democracy is supposed to work in a way that the citizen has some influence over the decisions that the administration makes, and it varies, as I'll show you, from administration to administration, how much input, outside input, comes in. But there are definitely ways that the citizen can influence the policy process, and what I hope is that you will decide that when you see a policy or when you see an issue that you like or don't like, that you feel passionately about, that you will try and influence the policy in that way. So I'm going to just give you a little historical background about policies, how national security policies have been made in the past. And I love this picture. This is the Lincoln War Cabinet in 1863. And the gentleman with the beard there is none other than our own Lancaster County guy, Simon Cameron. He was the Secretary of War in the Lincoln administration. His home is just over on in Mount Joy behind the Donegal Presbyterian Church. He was a big guy. After he was Secretary of War, he was appointed as a senator from Pennsylvania, and he had a very long and distinguished career, but he comes right here from the ground that we are sitting on. So let's just go over the three words that are central to this whole idea: national security policy. National, of course, means that it transcends states' interests. The Constitution gives the responsibility and the authority for conducting foreign policy to the President, very specifically, very definitively. And it provides for congressional input in one aspect of conducting international relations, and that's, of course, international treaties, which the Senate must give its advice and consent or ratify in order for a treaty to go into effect and become law in the United States. Security. Security has to do with all kinds of issues, from economic security, political security, social, societal security. So whatever issues arise in the international sphere, whatever issues affect the entire nation, those issues are covered under this whole rubric of national security policy. And then policy, it's really the most important word, I think, in this whole, of all those three words, because policy is implies some sort of consensus. the United States has policies. What those policies are designed to do is define our interests in any given situation, and then translate those interests into goals, and translate those goals into actions to protect those goals and those interests. So the policy aspect of it is really the dynamic aspect of it, and how the United States instructs its ambassadors, how the United States takes actions in international meetings, how the United States decides that it's going to support or not support a movement or an issue, or how it addresses an issue. That's policy. Every time the President does something in the international arena, every time the Secretary of State does something in the international arena, then that should be the result, and is the result, of a policy which was made according to a very well-defined process, and which should reflect national interests, and which should really be a reflection of national values, national goals, national interests. Now, obviously, this process is different from administration to administration, and I don't think there's any right way, and I'm going to show you some of the historical development of this concept of policy, how policy is arrived at. But the importance of the issue in terms of national security policy is how we define national interest. How does every individual citizen, how can you buy into national interests? And then let's take a look at a policy which was unpopular, which of course was the liberation of Iraq. Now, how does the individual citizen address a decision which was taken in this policy process to use American military force to liberate Iraq? A lot of people disagreed with that, but the people who made it, who made the policy, were given the responsibility and the authority to do that. So I hope you'll see in the course of what I'm going to say how this policy is made and how it can be influenced by individuals, how it's influenced by institutional arrangements. So let's go to so we know how Mr. Lincoln made policy. He had a war cabinet, and those guys sat around. This is the, now it's called the Lincoln bedroom on the second floor of the White House. There was no office buildings at the time. The whole U.S. government, the whole executive branch of the U.S. government was working right out of the second floor of the White House. And he consulted these guys, and that's how they made policy. Now, we don't know what kind of institutions were behind them. Did the Secretary of War have a staff? Because the old executive office building, which housed the government after it got too big for the second floor of the White House, the executive branch, wasn't even built until the 1870s. So in this in the Civil War, this is you're looking at making of national security policy right there. In the Second World War, the situation was probably even more restricted. Decision making was even more restricted. And this is a picture of President Roosevelt with, he wasn't called the National Security Advisor because there was no such position at the time, but Harry Hopkins was basically the National Security Advisor to President Roosevelt all during the Roosevelt administration. And he did many, 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 many things which today are done by the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor. But it was a very famous team. Harry Hopkins flew all over the world trying to convince allies and enemies alike to do what the United States wanted them to do. one of the kind of institutional aspects of national security policy making is the move from the president's office, which was on, remember, on the second floor of the White House, into the West Wing. Now, the West Wing was constructed by Theodore Roosevelt in 1902 because Theodore Roosevelt had a big family and it didn't fit the government offices on the second floor of the White House. There was no room for them after they housed his family. So he built the West Wing to house his office and the office of his advisors. We don't know exactly, I mean, the cabinet, there is a cabinet room in the West Wing, but we don't know exactly how he organized national security policy making, but he did make it possible for it to expand in terms of the numbers of people involved in it, and in terms of the institution being a little more organized than just what was happening during the Lincoln times. After September 11th, if you remember, one of those airplanes that was hijacked on September 11, 2001 was supposed to fly into the White House. After all those events of September 11, 2001, they took a look at the structural integrity of the White House and the West Wing, because then everybody's trying to figure out, well, what happens if there's a huge car bomb, and what would be the effects. And they discovered that there was no steel in 1902. No steel was used in the construction of the West Wing. And so they posited that a car bomb going off on the other side of Lafayette Park at a certain level would actually, the reverberations from that explosion would collapse the West Wing of the White House, because it was just straw and concrete. So they undertook a huge project to completely actually what they did was completely rebuild the West Wing, but they strengthened it, put iron rebars on the inside. Just, you know, something that nobody ever thought about until all of a sudden you're worried about what kind of bomb damage is going to happen. Here's President Roosevelt getting directly involved in national security policy. He met in the Bitter Lakes, which is part of the Suez Canal chain there, with King Abdulaziz. This is 1945, to try to cement an alliance with the Arabs at the very end of World War II. This took place on the U.S. Navy ship, the USS Quincy, and at a later stage, or a later point in this session that he had with King Abdulaziz, the British Prime Minister joined him. And this is, again, just a total aside, but they each gave King Abdulaziz a present at that time. The British Prime Minister gave him a Rolls-Royce car, and Franklin Roosevelt gave him a DC-3 airplane. It was the first really Rolls-Royce car, of course, in Saudi Arabia, and the first airplane ever in Saudi Arabia. That airplane became that was the beginning of Saudi Arabian Airlines. And of course, they had to find an American to fly the plane. They're still trying to find Americans to help them out. Let's go back now to a little bit of institutional development in terms of making national security policy. The end of the Second World War, the consensus was that we needed a rational and institutionalized approach to making national security policy. Now we no longer had just a Secretary of War, we had a Secretary of Defense, also created Secretary. The Department of Defense was created in 1947 as well. So the administration, the Congress, decided to put this into a law to actually formulate the exact way in which national security policy would be made. and that is the National Security Act of 1947. It sets up a series of groups, policy-making groups, and it sets up a progression of how policy should be made. At what level should it start? How should it progress? And how should, and what kind of inputs take place at each level? So the lowest level of any administration in terms of the political orientation of the officials is the assistant secretary level. So whenever administrations change, you take a look across the departments, the Department of State, Department of Interior, Health, Education, Welfare, whatever it is. And there is a level, you go secretary, deputy secretary, undersecretary, and then assistant secretaries. So all those levels, secretary, deputy secretary, undersecretaries, and assistant secretaries, they're all political appointees. And the reason for that is that the president wants to have people who are of his same ideological persuasion, who share his definition of goals and objectives and United States national interests. That's why these positions change. This is not like the UK, where they have a permanent staff of civil servants, and no matter who is the prime minister, those civil servants are still in those high-level positions. Not so here in the United States. So you have a huge turnover in government personnel down to the assistant secretary level every time there's a change in administration, and that's going to happen in 2016. And that's why there's such a backlog, that's why there's such a problem getting people confirmed, because down to the assistant secretary level, all these people have to be confirmed by the Senate. So you have a situation in which the administration is rushing, prioritizing, trying to decide which positions to fill first. And if they get opposition from the Senate, then they have to decide, withdraw, fight. So it's a constant battle, and the center of that whole issue is the White House Personnel Office. It's a very, very important and powerful office within the administration. So the assistant secretaries make up this interagency working group. Now, the interagency working groups are ad hoc. They don't meet on a regular basis. They meet according to the topic. So I'm just going to use as an illustration an interagency working group that I was involved in while I was in the State Department to show you how the progression works. In 1986, you remember Iran was at war with Iraq. And, well, of course you don't remember because you weren't around, but anyway. Iran was at war with Iraq, or Iraq really was at war with Iran. And the interests of Persian Gulf oil producers were being damaged because of this war. The Iranians, the Persian Gulf oil producers were in alliance with Iraq, and the Iranians were attacking their ships, preventing oil from leaving their ports. The government of Kuwait decided that the oil revenue was so important to Kuwait, to the stability of Kuwait, that they wanted to seek protection for their oil vessels. And so they made a proposal to the government of the Soviet Union, still around, and the government of the United States to reflag their vessels, either Soviet flag or American flag, which would force one or the other to protect the vessels while they were in the Persian Gulf. So this decision and this request was transmitted in a letter from the Emir of Kuwait to the President of the United States, to President Reagan. And at that time, I was the country officer, country director for the Arabian Peninsula, which is the policy formation unit, the lowest policy formation unit in the State Department for countries. So I handle all the countries of the Arabian Peninsula: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, Oman, and Yemen. So the White House received this letter, sent it to the State Department Operations Center sent it to me. Okay, so now my responsibility is to draft a response to this letter and to move that through the policy process. Well, first of all, I had to decide, or we had to decide, were we going to do it or not? And if we were going to do it, we had to know the consequences. What were the assets which would be required from the Defense Department if we reflagged Kuwaiti vessels to, what assets would be required to protect those ships? And that, of course, meant also a possible confrontation with Iran, because now we have American ships. Previously, these Kuwaiti vessels were being attacked by Iranian commandos, small boats, no actual Iranian Navy involvement in it. So I started the process to bring a recommendation, a draft response from President Reagan to the Emir of Kuwait. I started a process which would lead to an interagency meeting. And don't forget, the interagency meeting is staffed at the Assistant Secretary level. So the Department of State called for, because we were the ones that was assigned action by the White House on this particular letter and issue. And so we identified who was going to participate in this interagency working group. So of course you had CIA, Defense Department, in many cases the Treasury Department, because there are all kinds of issues, international financial issues. Probably had Department of Justice there. But all I'm trying to show is how the process works. So before we went into a meeting of the interagency working group, you kind of want to know where people are. You want to know what's going to happen. You want to know who is going to take what position, because you don't want to get into a situation where you get into an argument where you can't reach a decision to go forward. Now, in my estimation, the only real response that we could make to this letter from the Emir of Kuwait was to say yes. I mean, so there are several components. One, we couldn't let the Soviet Union say yes and reflag Kuwaiti vessels, because these Persian Gulf oil producers were our allies and our friends. Secondly, I believe that we should say yes because we needed to show our leadership in terms of the international oil situation, in terms of protecting the flow of the international oil out of the Persian Gulf. So we were planning, while we were planning this, Kevin, how am I going to do this? Oh, okay. While we were drafting the response to this letter and preparing the decision memo, which would go to the Secretary of State, which would then go to the which would then go back to the White House, to the President for his approval. We had interagency working group, and I guess it won't come as any surprise to you, nobody agreed with me. Nobody agreed with the position that the State Department was taking in terms of agreeing to reflag Kuwaiti vessels. The Defense Department objected. They didn't have the capability to adequately protect the vessels in the Persian Gulf. They didn't want to divert assets from other missions around the world. In any case, even if they could find the adequate ships to do this, they didn't want to divert them from the rest of the world. And it was the considered decision of the CIA that it was unlikely that the Russians would agree to this, and so there was no reason for us to really rush into this, to really try and take a leadership role. So we came to a complete standstill in terms of how to move forward, because you can't move the memo forward without having concurrence of the various agencies involved. At the time, what should have happened is that the interagency working group should have come to a decision about what to recommend to the president, and then that decision should have gone to the Deputies Committee. Now, the Deputies Committee is composed of the deputy secretaries of all the agencies that are involved in whatever ad hoc group is formed ad hoc because of the subject involved. Again, don't forget, this is still the political level. It's a very high political level next to the cabinet secretaries. The deputies then take the recommendation that comes from the interagency working group and they refer it to the Principals Committee. Guess what? The Principals Committee is made up of the secretaries of all the agencies that are involved. The Principals Committee recommends most actions taken by the US government are approved by the Principals Committee. In most administrations, the Principals Committee is directed or chaired by the National Security Advisor. In the Bush administration, Bush 43 administration, for instance, the Principals Committee was chaired by the Vice President and not by the National Security Advisor. So most policies end up being approved at the secretary level, at the cabinet secretary level. Now, the National Security Council is simply the National Security Council is simply the Principals Committee, but the chairman of the National Security Council is the president. So, under normal circumstances, and this is a picture of the National Security Council. If you just don't include the president, it's the Deputies Committee. And this is in the Situation Room in the White House in the West Wing basement. The National Security Council normally meets 3 or 4 times a year to take up really high matters of policy. For instance, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The policy to pursue that would not have been decided at the Principals Committee level. It would have been bumped up to the National Security Council. Not that there are any different people there, but the president is actually in charge of that decision. So the president would be involved in that decision on his own. Now, we don't know what issue this National Security Council was considering. And here's Secretary Hagel is there, Susan Rice, so this is in the second Obama administration. This room is very, very small. I don't even know how there was room. The guy who took this picture must have been, 5'2" and weighed 100 pounds, because there's just a really tiny little corner back here. The president's chair really backs up to the wall in that room. You can see that there are chairs along the sides, but when the National Security Council meets, you can see very few hangers-on actually get to come into that meeting, simply because of the high-level nature and the necessity for the cabinet secretaries to speak their minds freely. Look back here at the screens. Those are other members of the National Security Council who are brought in by secure video. So there is a well-developed secure video capability, so that even if they're not in Washington, they can participate. Okay, so that's how it should work, and that's how my memo should have progressed through the Deputies Committee, through the Principals Committee. Probably it would have gone to the National Security Council because of the implication of potential conflict between Iran and the United States. What actually happened in this case, of course, while all this is going on, I had back channel communications with the Defense Department. I mean, my colleagues, my counterparts in the Defense Department, my counterparts in the National Security Council, we were discussing this, and the position that was taken by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff against the idea of reflagging Kuwaiti vessels turned out to be a very strong objection, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was blocking any further progress on trying to decide this issue. My colleague at the Department of Defense knew that the position of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs wasn't shared by the political level in the Defense Department. And so she managed to get the draft that we had produced at the State Department up to the Undersecretary for International Security Affairs. And that person was a close friend of Caspar Weinberger. Caspar Weinberger was the Secretary of Defense at the time. He bootlegged a copy. He actually put a copy in his pocket and went into the Secretary of Defense's office and says, "Look, boss, this is something we have to do. We can't dither any longer. The Russians, by this time we knew through intelligence that the Russians were racing to prepare a positive response to the Emir of Kuwait." Caspar Weinberger, okay, remember you have this whole apparatus that's supposed to work. Caspar Weinberger took the memorandum from the Undersecretary for International Security Assistance Affairs, got in his car, and went to the White House and took that letter directly into President Reagan and said, "Boss, we have to sign this. We can't wait any longer." President Reagan signed the letter. It was dispatched back to the Emir of Kuwait, and we beat the Soviets by about a day and a half in terms of their response. So I'm just using this as a way to show how the process should work, how sometimes the process doesn't work because you have institutional jealousies and other institutional policies, other definitions of U.S. national interest that collide with the consensus, that may collide with the majority of others working on this issue. But that when you get the President of the United States to involve directly, and obviously there was a very close relationship between Secretary Weinberger and President Reagan, things like this can happen. Now, where was the staff work? Where was, but, what did President Reagan know about what he was signing? Caspar Weinberger, this was a really emotional reaction on his part because he was a Cold Warrior, and how could we possibly not agree to do something that we certainly didn't want the Soviets to agree to?
I have a question. When the letter comes from the Emir to President, the President doesn't read it before it goes through the process to have any idea what's going on?
Probably not. No. The staff would immediately assign action. I mean, it'd be an urgent matter. The President would sign. He would get the letter the same day, maybe, but we don't know. You don't know what's on his desk, so you don't know how he's organized to take a look at it. I mean, the National Security Advisor should be the one to bring these kinds of issues directly to the President if he has to see them. And frankly, the working of the West Wing in the Reagan administration is different than the working of the West Wing in 41, then Clinton, then 43, then Obama. Another aspect of this system is that you go from the working level, which is what is propelling or what's driving the interagency working group, the people who know the most about the subject, and as you progress through the stages of approval of a policy, you're moving to higher and higher levels of responsibility and authority, and those people have less and less knowledge about the actual subject. So they have to depend upon the knowledge of at the working level. But oftentimes you get to the Principals Committee, which is where a vast number of decisions are made, and you have the people who know the least about the subject making a decision, which can have huge national security implications, huge implications for the interests of the United States, for the security of the United States. So the system depends on confidence that the positions are adequately expressed and elaborated and detailed, and that the people that are involved in the process, because they're political appointees, are all in concert. I mean, they're all ideologically attuned to the White House, to the president, and the general drift or the general direction that the president wants foreign policy, national security policy to take. So let me just see if there's anything. Well, of course, the greatest foreign policy president, the greatest national security policy president that we've ever had was Richard Nixon. Despite all his other frailties and faults, he was just a brilliant strategist and national security policy expert. And of course, he had the great benefit of having another huge brain working with him, Henry Kissinger. Nixon really revolutionized the whole national security process, because when he came in 1968, it was, depths of the Cold War, Vietnam, all kinds of things were going on. But he himself was involved in the formulation of national security policy. And in many cases, policy papers which went up to the president would come back with Nixon's own handwriting on it. Don't tell me what we've done in the past. Don't tell me what what is comfortable, what's easy to do. I want to know. I want to see how you define U.S. interests. How did you come to this decision? What did you consider to be U.S. interests? And how can we protect? Once we agree on those interests, how can we protect those interests? So he was involved directly, and a lot of things changed during the Nixon administration in terms of the way the national security policy apparatus approached decisions. I regret very much that he had all these other domestic and other personality issues, because the United States was much, much better off just in terms of the strategic position under his leadership. And that brings me to another aspect which we don't see here in the so-called interagency process, and that's the Congress. You notice I didn't mention the Congress very much. There's really no role for the Congress in this process, except in that high space where treaties have to be approved or war has to be declared by the United States. And that pretty much was the situation through the Nixon administration. But as the result of Nixon's mistakes on the domestic side, the Congress, starting in 1974, took advantage of the weakness of the presidency, the weakness of the executive branch, to encroach upon foreign policy issues and decisions. And it's been really a downhill process ever since 1974, where the Congress has continuously asserted its views, its definition of national interests, and tried to get those definitions into the policy process by using the power of the purse, by funding or not funding certain programs that are necessary to have for the administration's policy to succeed. So we're kind of at a high point today in terms of the Congress's involvement in foreign policy, and it's very telling right now what's happening on the Iranian agreement. Now, the debate that's taking place on the Iranian agreement, to me, the weakness of that is that nobody agreed before the negotiations started. The Congress and the administration, and to a certain extent the American people, But it's very difficult to understand what the American people think on any particular issue because there's so many different views. But let's just go with the Congress and the administration. Before these negotiations started, you remember how they came about? They came about as a result of secret talks that were held between the Iranians and the United States in Oman in September 2013. Now, the weakness is that before those negotiations started, there was no agreement on what U.S. interests were in these negotiations and what would be the most desired outcome. You see, if the administration and the Congress had been together on that, we wouldn't be having this debate now. The debate we're having is it's good for the U.S., it's not good for the U.S., it's because no one has specifically defined what U.S. interests are in this particular case. There's no consensus agreement about what U.S. interests are in terms of Iran's nuclear, the development of Iran's nuclear weapons capability. So it's a complete breakdown of this very structured process, and I think that's where I'll end, is that this administration is not very good at working with this process. Many decisions take place outside of this process. They take place outside of the process in many other administrations. I mean, I lived for a year in the Bush 43 West Wing, and many things were taken outside of this process. So it all depends on the leadership of the president, the capabilities of the president, and how he chooses to organize policy making. So I think that's.
So basically implying that in this administration,
Okay, so that's yeah, I'm finished.
in this administration there is a lot of top-down processes.
Yes. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. A certain amount of that took place when I worked at the White House as well. I mean, Rumsfeld and Cheney were very strong figures, and sometimes we got orders. You know, we'd go home at night, even though it's 10 o'clock at night. We got orders when we came back at 5 o'clock in the morning to do something, and nobody ever discussed, wait a minute, where did this come from? But it came from the Secretary of Defense to the Vice President, who managed, you know, at 10 o'clock the night before to get the President to sign off on it. So it happens in every administration. Any other questions? Anybody ever see a policy that you didn't agree with and wish that you could get involved in it, wish that you could somehow have influence in policy? I mean, the liberation of Iraq is a perfect example. I mean, I think almost everybody in the country, by the time that was over, disagreed with the policy of our trying to liberate, or our liberating Iraq, and trying to build a new society in Iraq. But just as a matter of interest, the citizens disagreed with that policy before the election in 2004. I mean, George W. Bush was not a popular figure in the election in 2004, but we re-elected him. Even though that became a really difficult issue, but some say that was the first time he was really elected, 2000 not being, a real election. But we did. We voted for him a second time, even though most citizens violently disagreed with the policy to liberate Iraq and try to get deeply involved in developing society, a new society in Iraq. So there's a way that the population could have, sometimes the frequencies of these things, 4-year presidential elections, 2-year congressional elections, sometimes seems like a long time to try to change policy, but there was a policy that could have been changed in 2004 that wasn't.
voice. I think you can hear me.
We're recording.
So I enjoyed hearing your comments about Nixon and Kissinger. As a scholar of China-U.S. relations, Nixon played a huge role in my own field of study. How do you think historians are going to characterize the current foreign policy team? Not necessarily evaluative, good or bad, but what adjectives do you think historians will use to describe the Obama foreign policy team?
Weak. Weak.
You wanna
We
add
are
any
lacking
others?
in leadership. The United States is not, we don't have clear definition of what our interests are, and we don't have clear thinking in terms of trying to pursue those interests. So I think we're seeing that all over. Doesn't matter whether it's in the Middle East or in Ukraine or in the European economic situation. The voice of the United States is just not strong. People are not paying attention to the United States because we're not exercising a leadership role. So it's too intellectual. This administration is too intellectual. And that's, to me, that's their problem domestically, but it is certainly the problem internationally. I mean, people don't do what is logical. People don't do what is reasonable, and this administration assumes that people will do what is logical and reasonable. So, anybody else? I saw some other hands here.
As a computer engineer, I'm actually curious to see if there was any talk while you were in the White House about cybersecurity or anything along that lines nationally. Or
Well, you know, I was there September 2001 to September 2002, and of course we had cyber security measures, but in terms of cyber attack, no, this was not something then that was on the agenda. It has become a major issue, and today we're hearing about Russia hacking into the White House through the State Department. I think the most frightening thing is that it's not, these hacking episodes are not just episodic. I mean, they can put things into the system which will live there for a long time and continue to provide them with information. We don't seem to be able to detect.
Yes. Part of the reason, I guess, well, one of the problems I'm seeing nowadays is the real division between like the Democratic and Republican side. And just do you have any thoughts on how to increase like efficiency and more compromising, I guess, and to have a more unified nation?
But to have more what?
Have like a more unified nation and not something that's divided and just.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's take a typical day of a State Department employee at the level that I was when I was in the State Department, which was director of a major office. So you have 7 embassies, all reporting into the office. You have cabinet secretaries who have interests in those countries, trying to get you to agree to pursue policies which will help them, like Treasury trying to stop money flows from Dubai to Osama bin Laden. You have a lot of issues, complex issues, more issues than you can possibly deal with in a month or in a year. So you have to prioritize. The country officer, country director has to prioritize the issues that he's going to do for today. Sometimes the situation blows up, an American dies, an American gets killed. And of course, that takes precedence over resolving that kind of issue, takes precedence over everything else because it's congressionally mandated. I mean, protection of American citizens abroad, take the whole foreign policy arena. Protection of American citizens abroad is a separate law unto itself, and it is separately funded. So the Congress really looks at how the State Department protects Americans abroad. So you take that, obviously, well, you would take it seriously anyway, but I mean, it kind of overrides other policy issues when it's a problem. And then you have the, what I call the newspaper phenomenon. The Washington Post or the New York Times has an article about corruption in Saudi Arabia and how American defense material is being wasted or something like this. Okay, so a congressman will call the Congressional Relations Department or Congressman's office, call Congressional Relations Office in the State Department and demand to know what is this situation? Why are the Saudis wasting our military sales assets? And all of a sudden everybody is paying attention to this because maybe that senator or that congressman is key in a vote on something that's coming up that the administration really cares about. It may not have anything to do with foreign policy, but all of a sudden you have people from the White House calling you saying, you know, get this fixed now, because this guy is supposed to vote tomorrow on something that the administration really cares about. So, you know, you have the country director, and then under the country director there are officers that handle each country, but that's it. I mean, most countries, even big countries, have one person handling them, and in an office like mine, some of the smaller countries like Bahrain and Qatar, we had one desk officer for both of those countries. So the attention, and this is the basic level. You move up, the next level up from me is the assistant secretary. Well, you know, now you're talking about the assistant secretary for the whole Near East. So she happens to be a female at the current time. She's got to deal with, you know, everything from Morocco to Oman. And what's happening in my little office is also happening in every other office in the Bureau. So the attention to long-term policy issues is really pretty small. Only when these, you know, when these interagency groups get together, you know, do people actually have, you know, like, instead of having 30 seconds to think about what you're going to do, okay, so you might get 10 minutes of discussion with other knowledgeable people about this, but getting ideas in from the outside is very, very, very difficult. And we're not successful at all in using the potential of the country in terms of how we define our interests and what we do to go after those interests. I mean, I guarantee you that before those negotiations happened between the US and Iran in Oman in 2013, nobody sat down. There's a huge community in the United States that knows a lot about Iran. They know a lot about the situation in Iran, and I guarantee you nobody consulted those people, because there just isn't a mechanism to do so. There's no time to do so, because you're constantly under pressure to produce. I don't know if that answered your question. I feel like I kind of got away from the thread, but that, to me, that is one of the major weaknesses of our system, is that we're just so big, there's so many issues, that there's not enough time to just think about what would be the best definition of U.S. interests and how would we best go about protecting those interests.
A follow-up question on access and influence over process. You had direct counsel with George Bush Jr. and I guess Cheney to some extent too. Can you speak of any specifics where they implemented things, didn't need to go through a large process of committee, but you gave advice and they acted directly, or just give us an idea of the process?
I think I have to take the Fifth Amendment on. There were plenty of issues where that took place.
Maybe a more general question.
I mean, what would happen when something like that would come down from the Oval Office is that the bureaucracy would then fill in and make it look like the process had been followed, when in fact it hadn't been followed. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about Putin and his character and his willingness to listen to others who might be influential? What countries, maybe NATO, United Nations? I doubt United Nations.
You know, I mean, I think Putin has fallen off the edge to me, he's become a megalomaniac now. Because, I mean, just look, he should be going through the same process that I just described. Somebody should be defining what Russian interests are. Somebody should be figuring out what are the consequences. I mean, that's one of the really, really great things about Kissinger and Nixon. They game planned everything, every single option. It drove you crazy. I can't tell you how many times I had to write, what happens if we do this? What happens if we do this and they do this? I mean, it's like they gamed it right down to knowing exactly what every step was going to bring. Putin's not doing that. So he's fighting fires. He obviously wants to resurrect the influence of Russia internationally, but he's got a very, very weak base for it. And so now he has completely separated himself, in my view, from the Russian people, and he's acting as if he were a czar. And I don't know how long that can last. But
Does he have an inner circle that he takes advice from?
I'm sorry, I just don't know enough about Russia to know whether it is. To me, it doesn't look that way. Somebody, there's got to be rationality somewhere, but I don't see it. And besides, he often violates one principle, which is the head of state should, what the head of state says should be either the truth or it should be consistent. Well, he's not doing that. I mean, he's lying and he gets caught in lies, and that affects the situation as well. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I'm here. I live in Elizabethtown, and I have an office on the second floor of the library, so if you want to ask me a question or get in touch with me, send me an email, come visit me in the third floor of the library. Anybody here in the communications department?
Can we ask another question?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Could you make a distinction between ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other organizations considered terrorists, maybe Hezbollah, and how their interests may vary and how you would recommend dealing differently?
Well, of course, ISIS is the great, kind of Satan right now. The rise or the empowerment, let's say, of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists in Syria is what led to the establishment or the formation or the influence of so-called ISIS or Daesh. I really hate saying ISIS or ISIL. The Arabic word for it is Daesh, for that organization. They, just like Hezbollah, those two groups benefited from outside support, and outside support for very specific purposes. But let's just take a look at Hezbollah. Hezbollah was formed in the 1980s to be a policy arm of the government of Iran. I mean, it wasn't an organization before it was associated with Iran. Iran formed the organization through Hassan Nasrallah to be the, kind of dirty player arm of the government of Iran. And Hezbollah has sleeper cells. Through the 80s, Hezbollah developed sleeper cells all over the world, including right here in the United States. We know this. So that they're kind of at one end of the spectrum in terms of funding and support from another international source. Now, what happened in Syria is that two other entities, the Saudis with the Salafists and the Qataris with the Muslim Brotherhood, thought that they could use the capabilities of those organizations to attack and defeat the government of Bashar Assad. It was a tragic mistake on their part because they assumed that their financial backing would give them control over their actions, when in fact it did not do that. And so they became, each one of those organizations became rogue organizations. And now they are a threat to the people who, to the Saudis and the Qataris who actually built them up. But even after it was clear that these two organizations, the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood, were not going to remain under control, when Assad brought in Hezbollah, the Saudis continued and the Qataris continued to fund the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood, because now they were fighting Hezbollah. And of course, that's one of their most perfect situations, is to be in a proxy war with Iran and to try to damage the interests of Iran. So, okay, so those two groups built themselves up, and then, I mean, I don't think you can say exactly what elements of, I mean, the Salafists are definitely Daesh, but are there the elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is also called Nusra, how deeply involved they are with Daesh and in this really, really radical extreme group, or whether they're still kind of, moderate bad guys in terms of just being Muslim Brotherhood people. Oh, okay. Then, of course, you have Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's been around all, throughout this whole show in one form or another. Now, when, what was that guy's name? Zarqawi was in Iraq during the surge, 2006 to 2009. He was, a real strong Al-Qaeda guy. He grew up and was trained and funded by Al-Qaeda. So there are definitely Al-Qaeda elements there. They don't necessarily have the exact same interests as Daesh does. And certainly they don't have those same interests outside of Syria. So when you look at Yemen now, you see the Houthis. I mean, Yemen's situation is so totally messed up that it's really hard to understand. But 3 years ago, the Houthis were funded by the Saudis. In order to try to control them as a threat to Saudi Arabia, and now they're being supported by Iran. But then in the south, you have, in the kind of eastern part of the south of Yemen, you still have Al-Qaeda stronghold. But now ISIS seems to have moved into, or Daesh seems to have moved into Aden and that southwestern part. Al-Qaeda simply wants to control territory so they can protect their interests, and of course they would love to bring about the collapse of the regime in Saudi Arabia, but I don't know if they have the actual capabilities. Daesh, on the other hand, is looking just to expand territory. I mean, these guys are, for lack of a better description, I mean, they want to set up a situation in which they have a government that's ruled according to Sharia law. So they're going everywhere. Look what they're doing in Libya. It's incongruent, because how do they have the capability to be in all these places? But I mean, you can't deny the fact that they are. So scary.
Maybe one final question. Most of the audience here are computer engineers, technical people of some sort. Could you briefly just assess the United States' capabilities offensively and defensively for combating terrorism in technical context?
Well, I mean, this has got to be the growth industry. It has to be where everybody is looking, because we are so open, we are so vulnerable. Everybody, I mean, not just the United States, but everyone. China, Russia, if we decide to develop, or we certainly have decided to develop, but if we would decide to use offensive capabilities in the cyber sphere. So I think this is an issue that the public is just not really as knowledgeable as the policymakers are, and I think that's probably because the policymakers don't want to scare us to death. you know from your work with Scott Borg, how scary these things can be. I mean, one thing that you don't want to do, and I was just thinking that as Brian put my flash stick into the computer here, I mean, that's exactly how these sleeper organizations get stuff into the system. You know, they put the virus on a flash drive and hope that sometime in the next 2 years somebody will take that flash drive and plug it in somewhere that they can take advantage of. And of course they know when that happens. So controlling the spread is, unless you have some sort of plug-in for your flash drive that tells you whether there's something on it or not. Maybe that'll come. You know, maybe every time you go to put a flash drive into a laptop or a computer system, you plug it in somewhere else to see whether it's safe to plug in. But I mean, the possibilities are just infinite. And you don't, I mean, this is kind of like, in a way, mutual assured destruction. I mean, you don't want to start this, although obviously the Russians and the Chinese have already started this. I mean, Scott Borg will tell you that when he goes to China, he doesn't even take his laptop with him. I'm working now for an organization called the Center for American Progress, and a couple of my colleagues were